Hello, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar about planning for a week of classes. This is the first in a series of webinars that English Australia will be running aimed at new teachers and supporting new teachers. So it's great that you've come along to this one, and please look out for notifications of the other webinars in this series via our PD update newsletters and our social media. So I'm delighted to introduce today's presenter, Justin Moon. Justin is the master teacher at Greenwich College, and Justin has been teaching for 30 years and supporting teachers and mentoring teachers for around 25 years, including myself. Justin supported me a lot when I was new to teaching. So he's very well placed to be delivering this session, and we're delighted to have you here today with us, Justin. I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks very much, Sophie. Hi, everybody. It's a little bit strange doing this because I can't see any of you at the moment. So if you're in your pajamas at home, feel completely fine. I'm going to do a little bit of audience interaction, a couple of slides in, and then also some time at the end for questions and comments, etc. So the theme today, new year, new ideas, and planning for your week of classes. One of the reasons that we've looked at this is that it seems to me that a lot of people who are new to teaching or maybe have been out of the game for a while come back to teaching and almost have a little bit of a micro kind of vision of what's happening. So just let me move this. Okay. So in terms of why this topic, I want you to think about the idea of this applying to all kinds of courses. So GE, EAP, all the test courses, IELTS, the Cambridge Suite, etc. But the real focus here is that idea of helping new teachers to understand that by looking at the bigger picture, they're going to be more capable in the classroom. In a lot of certificate courses, teachers might only train to do a particular hour-long lesson and spend quite a lot of time preparing for it. I remember myself, in training, preparing for just a single demonstration lesson or an assessment lesson. So I meet a lot of new students and a lot of new teachers here at Greenwich who are still in that mode. And part of my job is to help them understand that they need to be able to look more holistically at what they're doing. So if you can do that, and if you can think about the week as a whole, then you're going to have a better sense of the through line of the lesson. So when we think about a through line, I want you to think about your favorite movie, or in some cases, even your favorite piece of music, particularly classical music or non-vocal, like instrumental music. There's often a through line. There's a thematic, there's a theme, literature as well. And in really satisfying creative experiences or, audience experiences, one of the things that we really resonate with is the idea of the through line, that things all tied up beautifully, that things made sense along the way. And then at the end, there was that lovely moment of realization of what the whole product is. So that sense of through line is something that I'll be talking a little bit about throughout this presentation as well. I think also when we look at our week as a whole, we're more able to think about effective and useful tie-ins, lead-ins, warmers, segues, etc. So all of the connecting tissue that sometimes we don't really appreciate if we're micro planning. Also, the incidental teaching that becomes available to us through this larger scale planning. I think it's also important for us to understand the materials we're using and to be really clear on how to use the materials to their best advantage. And so if we do all of those things, we can have more cohesion in the student experience. For me personally, obviously, our work revolves around the student experience, and for them to have a satisfying and fulsome experience through the week is obviously very gratifying for the teacher. I remember back in the dark ages last century when I started teaching, I used to prepare day on day. And there was always something a little bit lacking. And of course, I was growing my skills and I was learning to be a good teacher. But I know that once I started really understanding what I could do for a whole week at a time, it really gave me more perspective on my job. So the first thing that I want to talk about today are some of the variables that we have. So obviously our schools are different, our classroom setups are different, the things that we're teaching are different. And so there's so many different variables in terms of this particular idea. Before I do that, I want to talk about the idea of an aquarium. So I'm a fish keeper in my spare time. So when I'm not teaching, I'm looking after beautiful tropical aquariums in my house. And believe it or not, an aquarium, a fully planted large aquarium, is much easier to maintain than a goldfish bowl. This is because in that larger body of water, everything can live and contribute to the ecosystem. So a fully planted aquarium becomes a living thing. A goldfish bowl, on the other hand, is a really, really barren kind of environment. So again, I'm looking at that idea of the macro and the micro and thinking, well, when things are on scale, we're actually better able to manage them. You don't need to change the water as often. It becomes a living thing. It starts to look after itself. So I'd like you to think about that metaphor as well as we go through this. Are you being a bit goldfish bowl-y about it, or are you trying to create an ecosystem in your class through your planning? So let's look at those variables. Some of the things that you need to consider and that will be different for all of us here are the core hours that you teach, as well as the number of days that you teach. So here at Greenwich College, in the daytime, we teach 4 days a week. Fridays are an elective day, and in the evenings, it's 5 days a week. That will change your planning. The next point is the textbook that you're using and how familiar you are with it. So one of the things that I also notice is that sometimes new teachers are very keen to move on. But in fact, I would always recommend to new teachers to do at least 2 cycles of a textbook, simply to get a real sense of the materials that you're using. So the familiarity that you have with the textbook is going to affect the amount of planning and also your sense of the week of materials. Are you sharing your class? So some teachers might only work part of the week and share. I have a role where I teach 2 days a week and I'm in the office the other 2. So I'm one of those teachers who has to share. That has another whole set of difficulties and opportunities in it. And so that's one of the variables that you might have. Another thing is the availability of extension resources. So depending on the school that you're in and your own personal experience and your own personal stash of resources, how much digging around do you have to do? How much extra time do you have to spend on those extension resources, as well as making resources? Being really aware of what is available in your school is a really, really significant point here. I encourage my new teachers to always really explore the drive that we have and to think about the materials that are available to them. I come from a pre-internet teaching background. All of my training and a lot of my work was done pre-internet. I don't really have any problems just walking into a classroom with a pen and a whiteboard, and I know that I can do a good lesson. Tech is obviously on top of that, and the resources that are available are also on top of that. But making resources can take a lot of time. And I think sometimes new teachers are reinventing the wheel because they're not actually aware of what the school has that's available to them. When we think about those resources, etc., I'm also thinking about even the teacher's book, making sure that you've got a copy of the teacher's book that accompanies your textbook, making sure that you've got a copy of the workbook that accompanies that textbook. I remember being, really surprised about 3 or 4 months into my first ESL job when one of the teachers said, "Oh, check the teacher's book." I was like, "There's a teacher's book? Great. I wish I'd known that earlier." So really being aware of those resources and how you can use them and utilize them. Another variable is the punctuality of your students. So again, that varies from place to place. How much time do you actually spend teaching after you've done your lead in and your warm up and waited for quorum so that you've got enough students to actually, get on with things. So the punctuality may be an issue. The next point, the ability range in your class. So I'm sure all of us understand that in ESL, it's very rare to have a class that is purely and, on the same level of pre-intermediate. There's always shades of pre-intermediate. You're going to have some weak ones who've just come up from elementary. You're going to have students who are really ready to push on into intermediate. So the ability range in the class is going to affect how much material you need, how much extra material you might need to plan for, and how you allocate your time. The next point is the assessment requirement. So I think it's really important to consider that obviously some courses are more assessment heavy. So if you're doing EAP or a test program like the Cambridge Suite or IELTS, there's got to be time allocated to actually practicing those tests. That's going to take up some time, and it's also going to affect the way you plan before that activity so that it makes sense in the week. Continuing on with the idea of variables, I think one of the important things to consider is also the ethos of the school. So is there a guiding statement that helps you in terms of what your school sells? Remember, in ESL, we're selling a product, and the schools that we work for are brands. And so we need to think really carefully about the ethos and the way that our school wants to be perceived as an educator. Here at Greenwich, our ethos is that classrooms are collaborative, communicative, and person-centered. So that affects planning, because if you think about those ideas, collaborative, we want space for the students in our planning. We want them to be able to be involved. We want them to be able to contribute to and in part lead the way that they're learning. Communicative, because we want a lot of speaking at all stages of the lessons. So even in the teacher's presentation phase, we would expect a lot of CCQing, a lot of eliciting, and so a lot of time spent on speaking. And person-centered, because obviously we're dealing with people, and there's a whole range of things that are happening for us as teachers that are very much extra to the actual nuts and bolts of teaching the English language. So please consider how you are dealing with people, because that takes time. How are you building relationships with your students? Because that takes time. And there has to be opportunity for those things to grow and develop. You need to start thinking about your energy rhythms. I'm a morning person. My brain is best off in the mornings. That's when I do a lot of my planning. I know that I do my higher level or my higher energy work earlier in the day. I also know that that's when I do most of my presentation phases, because I know that's when I'm at my best in terms of the energy that I have for the class. By late afternoon, that's when I'm going into really, very student-centered areas where students can be producing a lot of the work, etc. So do think about your energy and where you are best suited to do parts of your lessons. On the other flip side of that is the students' energies. So daytime students are very different from evening students, for example. There's all these different factors that we need to consider, and all of them will be quite different depending on you and depending on the factors that are in your school. The next point is student needs and wants, and I think that's also a really important factor. There needs to be some ongoing process for you to deal with things that are not necessarily in the course book, but are clearly relevant and necessary for your students. Sometimes that's something like pronunciation. You might realize there's nothing about pronunciation this week, but a lot of my students are having problems. I might try and do a little bit of pronunciation work. It could be something like phrasal verbs. It could be something like an idiomatic lesson, something like this. So what do your students need and want? Finally, in terms of the variables, demands on your time outside of class hours. So how much time are you preparing? How much time are you spending marking? What are your other administrative duties? So I'd really like you to think about how you can really manage those other parts of your world as well. I encourage teachers here at Greenwich to try to incorporate some of their administration into their working hours. So if they can manage it and if the class is going well, a student-centered activity that's been checked and monitored, quickly going back to your desk, doing a little bit of your register of work, etc. Please think about how you can manage your time effectively by producing really good quality lessons that are very student-centered. That gives you a little bit of space where you can do some of your administrative tasks. So those are some of the variables that I'm interested in, because I think for everyone here, there'll be a unique set of circumstances that are going to impact and influence the way that you run your lessons and the way you plan for the day and the week. So at this point, if anybody would like to pop into the chat and mention anything that they're thinking about in terms of these variables, or any questions they might have at this stage before we get into the next phase, what do you think about these variables and what kind of issues does that bring up for you? So if anybody would like to mention anything in the chat, I'll just give you a couple of seconds. I'll just wait 20 or 30 seconds. If there's nothing, that's absolutely fine. Obviously, we can move on with the presentation, no problems. There's a comment that says it's interesting to think about the teacher energy rhythms as a variable. Work to your strengths, people. You know, one of the things that I'm really interested in is teachers being whole and complete, and really being very individual. I think it's really important that teachers work to their strengths always. So that's part of the rhythm of the week and also the rhythm of the day. And it you know, it does make a difference. If you know how your body works and if you know how your energy rhythms run, it can be really, really helpful. So there's no other comments at the moment, and that's absolutely fine. So let's move on, please. So we've looked at the variables. Now let's look at some of the immutables. So these are things that clearly we can't really move on or move past, and we must consider them in terms of how our school is running and how our lessons and our particular course is running. For me, there are 4 immutables. They are course content, revision, homework, and student counselling. So let's just look briefly at those. Obviously, with course content, you need to get through a particular set of content each week. And so textbooks are designed differently, courses are run differently, but at the end of the day, we do need to get through and make sure that the work is done. The next 3 are things that I'd like you to consider and really think about whether you're doing this enough. The first one is revision. So I ask my teachers to revise regularly. Revision needs to be consistent and it needs to be ongoing. One of our senior teachers here talks about meeting new vocabulary being like meeting a new person. So the first time you meet them, you know what they look like and you've got a little bit of information about them, but really it takes several meetings to develop a fulsome understanding of a person. In the same way, meeting vocab, meeting a grammar idea, etc. All of those things need to be revisited and refreshed for our students. Obviously, a lot of language teachers also know a second language themselves. Put yourself back in that mode. You know, what was it like when I was learning language X? How long did it take me to really understand a word or to be able to use a word fluently? How long did it take me to really get to the sense of a piece of grammar? So that's something that we really need to consider. And essentially, there should be ongoing revision pretty much every day in the week. And I'd like you to think about whether you really plan for that kind of revision. Next, I think an immutable, something that is unquestionably necessary, is homework. But I don't want homework to be onerous for the teacher. I don't want it to add to the burden of teaching in terms of administrative work, marking, et cetera, et cetera. And I'd like you to really think about the idea that homework doesn't need to be productive. It doesn't need to produce something. So it doesn't need to be written form. I think sometimes the go-to is, here's a page of grammar exercises. Please do those for homework. But I'd like you to consider that homework can be many other things, and sometimes it can be quite receptive. So for example, today I taught articles. The homework that I gave my students was that whichever kind of English they're listening to this evening, whether that's at their job, whether that's on Netflix, whatever, to listen out for the use of articles, to pay attention to how many times they hear a or an or the. What do they notice about that in native speech? So please don't think that your homework has to be something that you have to mark the next day. If you do give grammar sheets, and of course, I also give grammar sheets, but the next day, the answers are stuck on the whiteboard. Students can take a photo of the answers, or they can write them down themselves. They check their work themselves. They only come to me in the case where they don't understand the reason for something being wrong. So we've really got to think about how much time homework takes, but it is a really important part of the process. For a lot of our students, they're not using English a lot outside of the classroom. So some kind of homework is really important for them. Please also don't try and make your next lesson the next morning reliant on the homework. I don't know about your classes, but in my classes, I might only have 50% of people actually completing homework tasks. So we need to do it, but we also need not to rely on it in terms of, the next day's work. Lastly, here, in terms of the immutables, I'd really like you to consider, where is the student counseling happening for you? Where is the opportunity for you to have some one-on-one time for a student briefly, where you're able to discuss both pastoral care and academic advice? We need to check in with students. How's things going for you? How's life in Sydney? How's your study? What things were easy and hard for you this week? I think it's really important that we have some time where we can do those kinds of things. So for me, those variables, as the name implies, things that are going to change, things that are going to evolve, and things that are going to affect each of us very, very differently. But those 4 immutables are things that really we need to be doing those things. So what I'd like to do now is move on to an example from Greenwich College. This is the outline for the week that we give all of our teachers as they do their onboarding process. So everybody in the school, in the general English cohort, follows these same ideas. So very quickly, I just want to run through this. You can see it's from left to right, before lunch and after lunch, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So on Mondays before lunch, we revise the previous unit. After lunch, we do the vocabulary and the reading from this week's unit. Tuesday is grammar point 1 from the textbook, followed by consolidation and extension. And there's room on Tuesdays for students' needs and wants. Wednesday is quite a heavy day. We have grammar point 2, and in the afternoon, we have the writing lesson, both from the textbook. On Thursday, we return the writing. There's the consolidation or extension of grammar point 2, and then there's more revision. And that can be communicative, that can be games-based, no problem, but revision of the week. After lunch, we do our test. So during the test, we also ask our teachers to do some counselling. This is the opportunity we give for our teachers to talk one-on-one. We're lucky in this building here at Pitt Street, we've got glass walls. So we set up our tests, we take phones away if necessary and place them on the teacher's desk. And then the teacher can take one student out at a time for a brief counselling session, 2 or 3 minutes with half of the class each week. So ideally, you get to speak to 8 or 9 people in that day. You get to think about some of their needs and wants. And also it's that pastoral care element where the student gets to know, my teacher's looking out for me. They know my name, they know a little bit about me, and they're interested in my improvement and my advancement. We do cross-marking here, except for the writing. So after the test itself, we'll hand the tests out to other students. We cross-mark, answer their questions, et cetera, and then we finish the day with some kind of communicative activity, an ending that wraps up the week. Friday is an elective day, and very few of our students choose to come to school on Fridays. So that's not really part of the schedule. So when you look at that, you can see that there's particular things on particular days, and we ask all of our teachers to stick to this. These are the bones, the absolute bones of what we want our teachers to do. So what I've done next is I've kind of expanded that out a little bit to think about some more of the factors that are at play. So let's look at this more deeply. If we think about planning for the week and what that might involve, on Mondays before lunch, we're going to return their Thursday writing from last week. So that test that they did on the Thursday has a writing component. You'll need to mark that over the weekend or in your time and then bring it to work on Monday. We give them time for two-stage correction, everywhere from pre-intermediate and above. Then, if you gave Friday homework or Thursday afternoon homework, maybe Monday is the time where that comes into play. And maybe that relates to this week's work. So again, when you're thinking about the whole week, you start also looking at the end and beginning of the week and how those things might be able to tie into each other. And then we look at the revision from last week. After lunch, we have the vocabulary and reading, the extension of that theme or language, and we give some homework for Tuesday. So you can see there's a couple of little extra elements there, more filaments, more things that are tying in your week. On the Tuesday, the students correct their own homework from Monday. They do revision of the vocab from Monday, and then they get into grammar point 1. So again, tying in between your days and making sure that there's space for things like revision. After lunch on Tuesday, they'll do consolidation and extension of the grammar point, and then they'll be able to also have some time for student needs or wants. Again, this is probably something that you planned last week by asking, is there anything extra that you'd like to do? Or I think that, this is a need that my students have. That's something that I'm going to address. And we would give some homework for Wednesday. On Wednesday, students correct their own homework from Tuesday. We revise vocab and grammar from Monday and Tuesday, and then we deliver grammar point 2. After lunch, we do the writing task, which incorporates grammar points 1 and 2. Maybe there's some time for student needs and wants, and then there's communicative activities, and there's homework for Thursday. And remember, please make sure that you're not always just doing productive homework. Ask your students to think about things. Ask your students to notice things. Ask your students to be more aware of English as a living thing out in the real world. On Thursdays, students correct their own homework from Wednesday. We return the writing from yesterday. We give them time for two-stage correction. We consolidate extension of grammar point 2, and then we do some revision of Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, because after lunch, they have their test. We do the student counseling, we do some cross-marking with the students, we have a communicative ending, and then maybe we actually set weekend homework for Monday, and maybe that homework actually ties into next week. And so there we are, back at Monday, and there's that homework task again. So this is all about those segues and lead-ins and warmers, all of those things that tie the week together. So even though the first block that we talk about, those basic bones, it's really a teacher's job to think about, how do I make this make sense? So from this, I'd like you to consider, does your school have an overview of when you should be doing things? If they do, great, follow that. If that's what your school asks you to do. If they don't, I want you to be able to think of a schedule like this. I really want you to consider, when do you do particular parts of the book? Please don't just go from page 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 because that's what's in the book. What makes sense? How does the whole week tie together? So those are some of the things that you can sort of think on and develop as you go, to think, when does it make sense to do these items from the textbook, and what else do I need to do to make sure that everything is tying together and making sense? So very quickly, before we hand over to questions and comments, the benefits of doing this, the benefits of really thinking about how lessons flow and tie into each other. The magic of good teaching is when it looks effortless. And that very rarely happens if you are micro-planning. When you have a bigger sense of the week, it really allows you to have a frame of reference for your own teaching, for your own comments, for the subtexts, the things that are going on between the lines, for the jokes that you use, whatever your shtick is in class. So having that theme in mind for the whole week really helps you to make your lessons seem like there's, a real flow to them. I think also seeing the whole picture helps you to anticipate problems, because when you're only micro-planning, you're not going to really see the sense of what the week requires from the students. And so if you do look at the whole picture, it helps you to really think about any problems or issues that might come up. It also stimulates your creativity. I really think when we step back and look at the whole scenario, we have a much broader perspective of what we can do. And we get ideas from each part of the book, like, oh, that's coming up. Oh, well, maybe I could do such and such for my warm-up tomorrow or, today. So it's all about this kind of, all of the parts feeding into each other and informing each other. I think also that you'll feel more in control of both the subject matter and the running of the class. So if you've only got heads down one day at a time, that doesn't give you a lot of a sense of control or a sense of authority over your material. As I mentioned at the very start, students will respond subconsciously to a satisfying through line. I hope you've all had the experience on the last day of the week, be that the Thursday or the Friday or the last day that you teach a group, where they all just go, thank you, we had a really good time. And that's often because they've seen the sense of the week. They've seen how the week works. And so by the end, they're like, everything fit together so well. Everything worked. That's really satisfying for them. It's also really satisfying for you as a teacher. Don't forget also that routine helps people, students, feel safe. And so that's something really important for us, because learning is change. Change doesn't happen if people don't feel safe. So one of our jobs is to really create those safe places, and routine really, really helps in that. Finally, some invocations. Things that I really want you to think about, please. Be aware of the full range of possibilities in the materials. Okay, so that's what I said, even from, oh, there's a workbook. There's the teacher's book. Make sure you know what's available to you. Also think about the students in your class, because there's a lot of possibility in the students that you're teaching as well. Also, I'd encourage newer teachers not to be too hasty to move on. Really stick with something and get to a point where you can do it well. It's quite a good idea to do a course a couple of times over to really develop your skills. Also, think about timing and learn to find the rhythm in yourself and in your day and also in the week. And finally, build healthy work relationships with co-teachers. I think it's so important that we share and collaborate and inquire and admit that we don't know everything, and be absolutely fine with going, hey, can somebody help me out with this? Learn from each other. It's so important that we develop these healthy work relationships. Also be really open with your managers and leaders about what you need from them. Okay. Don't think that you have to do it alone. There's a whole school infrastructure in place. So hopefully there's place there for you and space there for you to ask for what you need in terms of support. Finally, think about your job holistically. So rather than day by day and what's going to happen today, really start thinking about what is the week ahead of me, and how does a little bit of extra planning at the very start help to smooth things out over that time. So that's the end of my time, and I'd like to open it up again to any questions or comments, please. So Sophie, are you able to have a look at the questions and comments?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, if you do have any questions for Justin, then please pop them into the chat box. There's a couple of comments in there already, Justin. So Jackson said that he completely agrees that having a greater perspective of your week leads to creativity and will produce more magic, nothing more satisfying.
It really does. Yeah.
And
Sorry.
no, that's okay. Ellie has said that she agrees with finding the right rhythm.
I think it's really important to remember that you're a human first, you're a teacher second. So whatever job you're doing, you really do have to think about, okay, how do I use myself as a tool? When am I of most benefit? When does my brain work best? When is my body most agile? When am I able to do these things for the benefit of my students so that they really get, a great product? It's something that I sometimes feel like we're too rushed, and especially if we're micro planning, we're kind of, what's next? What's next? What's next? What am I doing? Have I got enough resources? And we don't actually consider ourselves as the vehicle of those resources and the teaching.
Yeah, great point. And I think, you were talking about if you don't have a schedule like this that's recommended by your college, then to take that time at the beginning of the week to do some extra planning, to map out your week and how useful that is.
Because the whole thing, once you map out a week, and of course you're tweaking to see what works, but essentially that works every week, because you're going to have to do listening, reading, writing, grammar. They're all parts that we all have to do. I just noticed this question from Bronwyn about how does it work holistically when you co-teachers are sharing a class. I share a class, so that's what I have to do. And I actually just hired a new teacher to be my other half only a couple of weeks ago. We're in the very beginning of understanding how each other works, but having those separate days with very clear parts to do means that we never cross over in terms of we've all walked into a class and gone, oh, so we're doing this now. And they say, oh, we did that yesterday with the other teacher, So having that clear schedule and one that you can agree on with your co-teacher actually protects you both. But I think it's also really important to start developing the synergy. Brooke and I went out and had a coffee and just sat down for 20 minutes and actually talked to each other and got to know each other and investigated about each other's teaching, thoughts and how we want to run a class. So of course it's a little bit more complex, but it's absolutely achievable. And especially if there's a week of planning that you're both privy to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think those handover notes are so important to keep that sense of cohesion throughout the week. So you were talking about how, anticipating issues, but also being informed by how activities go with students and passing that information on, saying, look, we did grammar point 1, but I don't think they've really got it. Or we did it, they're doing brilliantly. Just making sure there's comments on the schedule as well, I think is really useful.
Absolutely.
So there was a question also from Ellie, and she's asked how we can make students do a little more out of the classroom and not just rely on what they learn in class. So I think you were talking about homework, and that probably prompted that question.
Yeah, I think that's really the thing though, Ellie. I think students balk at the idea of doing more work like they did in class for homework. If they're doing the activities in class and doing grammar worksheets, which they should be doing orally, of course, please think about how you're using grammar activities, etc. As much oral practice as possible, because that's what they can't do at home. But asking them to be more aware of the language, it's not such an onerous task. And if we can, I think a lot of students need to be taught how to think about the language. Everybody can learn grammar structure, or most people can learn grammar structures. Most people can learn vocab, but to actually have an inquiring mind, I think that's part of the job, is developing the inquiring mind, because then they're always doing homework if they've got the right frame of reference in terms of how they're thinking and inquiring.
Yeah, completely agree. There's a question here. You talked about not moving on from a course too quickly and instead reteaching it if you're new to that course. Do you have any advice on taking notes to improve the experience from course to course? So that is, do you just drop ideas in the textbook? Do you keep a journal, spreadsheet? Any tips?
Again, depending on the process. So here, the teacher has a copy of the textbook, which is essentially their own. So I'm always making notes in my copies. So my textbooks actually become these really fabulous resources because there's, ooh, did this warm up? It was fantastic. Or make sure that you don't do question 6 here because it's irrelevant. You know, like, so you've got to be really aware of what to do more of and what to do less of second time around. I think some people might have a not so great experience of a textbook first time through, and so they want to move away from it. I tell my teachers, the pearl comes from the agitation, you know, that like, you've actually got to be a bit uncomfortable sometimes to really get the value of something. So rather than moving on, all right, here I am in week 1 of this course book again. I know the things that didn't work. So if you're a techie and you're good at spreadsheets, keep spreadsheets. If you've got a personal copy of the textbook, write them in the textbook, whatever it takes, but pay attention to those notes again. So the reason I do it in the textbook is because the next time I open that book, you know, as soon as I look at pages 67 and 68, I'm like, oh, yeah, right. All these things to think about this time around. A journal is a great idea. If you've got that space for self-reflection, a journal is fabulous. But I think having it in your textbook is actually the most immediate way of keeping notes.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've also heard of people that have course journals. So they keep a journal, but instead of being, you know, by day or by week, it's course journal. So then if they come back to that course in 6 months' time or a year's time, they have their journal and, like you're saying, revisit it before they teach that unit again so that it's fresh in their minds how it went last time, what was challenging, what went well.
Yeah, and that's the thing. You're going to teach that course again. If you're planning on being a long-term teacher, which I think most of us are, you know, I can't think of how many times I've taught Headway Upper Intermediate Unit 6 in my 30-year career. No idea, you know, but a lot. So if you're not paying attention, you're going to make the same mistakes again. First time you make a mistake, it's not a mistake, it's a learning. If you make the same mistake again, then it's a mistake, you know, like that's just silly. So I think it's really important for us to be aware of what we can do better all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Justin, there's a lot of comments in the chat, people appreciating your ideas and saying that they resonate with their work. So thank you very much for presenting today. It was a really, I guess, personal presentation. A lot of your personality shone through and a lot of your pearls of wisdom as a mentor really shone through. I got a really great idea of what you'd be like as a mentor. So it was lovely to have that experience again. I really love the phrase connecting tissue throughout a course. I think that's one that's going to stay with me. And I love that idea of, like, you know, parts of your week informing other parts of the week and feeling like there's a dialogue throughout the week in the course and in your lessons. So thank you so much again for presenting today. And thank you for everybody for attending today.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Thanks very much. I can't actually see any of you, but I'm just waving to everybody.
Yeah, and if you did attend today, we'll be in touch with you tomorrow, and we can share the recording and also tell you how you can access your certificate of attendance for this webinar as well.
Thanks very much, Soph. See you later.
See you.